everyone, my name is Lakin Kroll, and I'm the Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator at the ECCRC. I have Dr. Jennifer Khoury here with me, and we have lots of exciting things to discuss. But first, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the ECCRC and MSVU is in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet titles and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. We also pay respect to the histories, contributions, and legacies of African Nova Scotian communities that have been here for over 400 years and the 52 African Nova Scotian communities throughout the land today. Dr. Jennifer Khoury is an assistant professor and Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Interdisciplinary Studies in Neuroscience and the Department of Psychology at Mount St. Vincent University, or MSVU. She also holds an adjunct position in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie University and is the director of the Developmental Psychobiology Research Center at MSVU, also known as DPRC. If you have any questions about her work, please feel free to send us a message and we will get to your question to the DPRC team to be answered. So without further ado, Dr. Khoury, I'll let you introduce yourself, your background, your research interests, or anything else you'd like to share.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction. And again, thanks to the ECCRC for doing this social media takeover. So like you said, my name is Dr. Jennifer Khoury, and I'm an assistant prof in Tier 2 CRC here at the Mount. I'm also a registered clinical psychologist, and my clinical and research interests really focus on children and families. So my research is pretty diverse, but in a nutshell, I'm really interested in the impact of early life stress on infant and child biological, psychological, and social development. And I'm interested in development really spanning from pregnancy all the way throughout childhood. And so I study different kinds of early life stress, things ranging from, the family environment, caregiving behavior, parent-child interactions, parent well-being and mental health, as well as adverse childhood experiences. And I also study different aspects of neurobiological development, really as mechanisms kind of linking these things. So how does early life stress impact child's or infant neurobiology, and how does that neurobiology in turn impact their social, emotional, and mental health outcomes?
Very interesting stuff, and I'm excited to hear more about your project. So jump into that. What is the Developmental Psychobiology Research Center, and what is the center researching?
Yeah, so the DPRC is a research center that I am leading. So it's a research center / a lab here at the Mount. And we do a lot of different kinds of research studies, but we can kind of sort of pin them down into two categories. One, we do in-person research projects, and those almost always include caregivers and children. So we have them come here to the center at the Mount, and they do different things. We usually do longitudinal studies, and so what that means is that we follow individuals across time. So we might have a study that starts in pregnancy, and then we end up following the parent and their infant throughout the early years. All the studies are multi-method also. So we examine different aspects of neurobiology. We look at stress markers, we look at brain imaging, and those kinds of things. And I could talk about that in more detail later. We also do observation. So we observe families interacting, and we video record it, and we code it later for emotions and behaviors and things like that. We do interviews, we do questionnaires. So it's kind of, there are a lot of different sort of pieces to the puzzle in terms of our in-person research. And then we also have a line of research that involves systematic reviews or meta-analyses. And that doesn't involve people actually coming to the lab. That involves us looking at prior work that other researchers have done and reanalyzing that to really answer a question on what's the state of that literature and where can we go from there.
Amazing, and with such interesting work and so many methods to use, I'm curious, what got you interested in this area of work?
Yeah, so I mean, in grad school, the lab that I was part of really focused on biopsychosocial development. And if you sort of think about child development, there's so many factors that can have an impact, right? And all of those things kind of work together in a way, right? And I think that that idea just fascinates me in trying to kind of put all the pieces to the puzzle together. I'm also really interested in this perinatal or early life period because I think that it's crucial to later health and development. Being a clinical psychologist and being interested in mental health, we know that adult mental health or even adolescent mental health, child mental health, it often has its roots in very early development, potentially beginning in pregnancy. And so I see this early period as a window really of opportunity for early intervention and for prevention for some of these mental and physical health problems later on.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think, that's the early years are so critical for that reason. It has, it's a lot of the stepping stones for the rest of a person's life. Can you give us a brief explanation of what stress is and how that can impact people?
Yeah. So stress is so many different things. It's hard to kind of define it. But essentially, it's the body's kind of physiological response to some type of a situation or some type of an experience where someone perceives that experience as being more than what they can cope with. Okay. So it's almost always that it exceeds our coping abilities. And so stress is kind of like your body's response to kind of kick into action, to prepare yourself and your mind for how to deal with this stress. That can involve a physical reaction, it can involve an emotional reaction, or even a psychological response. The thing with stress is that everybody experiences it. It's a universal. Infants even experience stress, and that might be a bit of a foreign concept, right? But everyone experiences stress, and it gets a bad rap, but stress is not always bad. Some level of stress is actually good. It's essential, right? If you think about when you're in university, if you had no stress about your exams, you probably wouldn't be motivated to study and you probably wouldn't do well, right? So a little bit of stress and learning to cope with minor amounts of stress is actually a healthy part of development. It's when stress is recurrent and it's chronic that it can take a toll on our physiological and our neurobiological sort of systems. And it's at that point that it leads to risk for mental and physical health problems and can impact development in an adverse way.
And thank you. That was a really great explanation. I like that you acknowledge, like it's, stress does have a negative connotation sometimes, but I like that you acknowledge that it's can be a good thing as well. In your work, you talk about the biopsychosocial factors that can impact development. What are some of those factors?
Yeah, there's so many of them. So this isn't going to be an exhaustive list, but I can kind of tell you what sorts of things we look at. In terms of the biological side of things, we're really interested in stress and stress hormones. So the main stress hormone in humans is called cortisol. So we look at that in different ways in hair and saliva. We're also really interested in brain development. So we do different brain imaging techniques. Whether that's looking at structure or function of the brain, genetics, or this idea of epigenetics, this idea that basically your experiences can modulate the expression or turning on and off of different genes that you have. So those are all different sort of biological processes that we're interested in and that we look at in one way or another. Psychosocial aspects really can be so broad. It could be parent-child relationships, parenting behavior, child emotion regulation, social emotional development, how they express their emotions, their social functioning with peers, with siblings, broader aspects of child development, like whether they're meeting developmental milestones, social emotional problems, mental health problems in parents and kids. So those are kind of the different psychosocial aspects that we're interested in.
Thank you. That's a great explanation. And on cortisol, the DPRC made a story on our takeovers that you can check out that explains a little bit more about what cortisol is and how it's involved in their work. What impacts do you think your work could have on parents and their children?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the overall goal of our research is really to try to foster positive child, development, right? And so we aim to bring awareness to the importance really of early life stress and of early child social emotional challenges, like of infant mental health, right? We're trying to bring awareness to that, and trying to highlight risk and protective factors really so that families can become aware of that. They can learn sort of optimal strategies to try to address these things. And ultimately, for us to also inform, social and policy changes so that we can inform different kinds of early interventions and prevention programs, community outreach and things like that, so that the knowledge that we're gaining about these biopsychosocial factors can actually be translated to real life things that parents can do to help their children, and to foster their children's development.
I think that's such a valuable thing about research is being able to, find things out and apply them, and then people can use research in their day-to-day lives. I think it's so valuable. So the DPRC uses an interdisciplinary approach to research, meaning that you can use multiple methods, or ways to collect information. Can you give us some examples of what this looks like, or what are some of the methods that you use?
Yeah, so we use it like a lot of different things, and it probably depends on the specific research study exactly what methods we're using. But essentially, the methods focus on the biological, the psychological, and the social aspects of child development. So, for example, if we're thinking about neurobiology, we collect saliva and we collect hair, and we use both of those to assess cortisol levels. They mean different things. You can check out that story to help sort of explain that. We also look at saliva to examine other kinds of biomarkers, like markers of immune system functioning. We assess cellular aging by looking at chromosome markers, something we call telomeres. I believe we have a story on that also, which are basically caps at the ends of our chromosomes that sort of protect our cells as we age. So we look at all of these different things, and we look at brain imaging, the structure and function of our brains to see how stress is having an impact, because we know that stress impacts all of these different facets of neurobiology. So that's sort of the neurobiology aspect. In terms of other methods, we use questionnaires parents and older kids can complete. We do interviews, and we do a lot of direct observations. We actually have an observation lab as part of our lab space in the DPRC, where we have cameras set up. I'm actually in the observation room right now. So, there's an area for the kids to and parents to play and interact. And we have cameras at both sides of the room so we can observe how families interact with each other. We can code their emotions and their behaviors as they're doing different kinds of activities. So direct observation is another aspect. We do interviews with parents and kids as well. And then in terms of the interdisciplinary aspect, I'm not an expert on all of these things. I really heavily rely on collaborators and other professors in other disciplines, who have expertise in these areas, to really be able to assess these things from all these different sort of levels. So colleagues who specialize in other areas of psychology or neuroscience, child and youth study, nursing, nutrition, etc. So we can really get at the different aspects of child development.
Excellent. Thank you so much. You have 4 active projects going on at the DPRC right now, and I'd love to hear more about them. Let's start with the COVID-19 Pregnancy and Early Childhood Development Project. Can you tell us a bit about this project and what the purpose is?
Yeah, happy to. So, I mean, we all know the COVID pandemic has, taken a huge toll for, a lot of people really around the world. But it's had a particular impact on parents and on kids. And we also know from sort of the prenatal stress literature that stress in pregnancy is not good. And that stress during pregnancy, pregnancy is really a critical time for the development of the brain and other bodily systems that are essential sort of for healthy development, and stress during that prenatal development can have a negative impact on child development. So we actually started this study in 2020, in the spring of 2020. I was actually still in Ontario at that time. So this sample is from Ontario. And we've gotten funding from CIHR to continue to follow these families. So we have 300 pregnant people who were pregnant in 2020, basically, when the pandemic hit. And we're following them throughout the first 3 years of life. And we're interested in a couple of things. One, we want to know how stress during pregnancy, like stress related to COVID, how that impacts child's psychosocial development. So how does it impact their social emotional development, et cetera, their cognitive development. We also are really interested in how the prenatal aspects of stress are also linked to the child's stress response at a biological level. So I'll tell you a little bit in terms of the methods, how we're assessing that, but how is prenatal stress linked to child stress? And then third, we're really fascinated by the idea that stress might be acting as a mechanism. So maybe prenatal stress is linked to child stress, which in turn increases risk for that psychosocial development, adverse psychosocial development. So like I said, we have the sample from 2020, and we've been following them through pregnancy, after birth, at 6 months, at 15 months, and we have we're currently running the 2-year follow-up, and we'll have a 3-year follow-up as well. And we measure psychological distress. The parents report on their mental health and their stress levels. The impact that COVID's had on their family, they tell us about that. And we also have collected hair samples throughout pregnancy from the parents. And with those, we're going to look at long-term levels of cortisol. So cortisol actually accumulates like in your sweat. So it accumulates in your hair shaft. So we can measure, based off the length of the hair, cortisol levels over several months, essentially. So we can look at their levels of cortisol in their pregnancy and in the postpartum, and we can see how that's associated with their child's level of cortisol and also with their child's other biomarkers of stress. And then we're assessing how that's related to the child's social emotional development. And we're assessing that using questionnaires. And for some of the families who are willing, we're doing home visits where we're actually doing developmental tasks with the families in their home to assess child's development. And we do have some preliminary results from this study because it's been going on for a couple of years now. So we've learned, one, that pregnant people are experiencing incredibly high levels of mental health problems and distress, in some ways triple to what we would expect from before the pandemic. So that's one thing. The second thing, we have a paper that's going to be under review shortly, where we're actually seeing that those levels of distress, although they're coming down a little bit as the pandemic kind of goes on, they're still way higher than what we would typically expect, even at 15 months postpartum. So it's really calling for additional social support and mental health support that's needed by these families. And then another early finding is that prenatal stress, and in particular anxiety in pregnancy, is associated with birth outcomes in this study. So parents who experience higher levels of anxiety during pregnancy, during COVID, their children are more likely to have a lower birth weight and to have a shorter or be younger, essentially, in terms of their gestational age, and to have more problems at birth. So we are showing that there's a direct effect between this prenatal stress and birth outcomes, and we'll see in terms of how that impacts later child development.
Amazing, thank you for that. You also have a project on titled Understanding the Impact of Maternal Childhood Experiences on Perinatal Biopsychosocial Risk and Resilience. Can you tell us a bit about this project?
Yeah, that's a mouthful, that title. Essentially, this study is really interested in intergenerational transmission of risk. So we're interested in how a parent's early life experiences, like early experiences of adversity or even early positive experiences, we know that that has an impact on their stress physiology and biology. And we also know it has an impact on their children. And we want to focus on the perinatal period to see if we can assess some of the mechanisms that might be responsible for that. So again, it's this intergenerational transmission of risk. What are the biopsychosocial mechanisms that might account for that? So stress physiology, same kinds of methodology, cortisol, telomeres, things like that. And how does it impact very early infant development, infant birth outcomes, as well as very early psychosocial development, as well as milestone development. And so this study follows pregnant people from pregnancy, post-birth, and 6 months postpartum. And that is a study that's happening here in Nova Scotia. We're actually actively recruiting for it. And so anyone who's interested, we welcome them to fill out the eligibility survey that we have. And again, it involves 3 time points where you can come to the lab, or we can come to your home if that's easier, to sort of track how parents' early experiences sort of impact their pregnancy and their infant's health and development.
Awesome. So if someone's interested in participating and want to fill out the pre-survey, where can they find that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a social media post that has like a QR code that they could scan. They could also visit our research website, the dpresearchcenter.com, and there's a Get Involved link. And if you scroll down there, there's a direct link to that eligibility survey.
Awesome. And we'll link that on our social media as well. So hopefully it's easily accessible. There's also a project on child emotion regulation. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I know that's an upcoming project. So what are the plans for that one?
Yeah, so I'm really excited about this project. We're about to launch it very soon, within the coming weeks. This is a really cool study. It's not on, so most of the other work, it's on like this perinatal period. This is actually like a preschool early childhood study. So we're looking at 4 to 6 year olds. And we're really interested in how kids develop their ability to regulate their emotions. So how do kids learn how to deal with their emotions, to express their emotions, and to modulate them? And prior research really shows that the family context is quite important for that, and early caregiving is really important to that. We're trying to build on that work in a couple of ways. One, most research looks at single parents, like the effect of, say, one parent and the child. We're doing a multi-caregiver study where we're having 2 caregivers come into the lab, and we're watching them, we're observing them participate in different tasks with their child, and we're seeing how the family dynamic kind of works. Another way that we're adding to the literature is we're not just interested in caregivers, we're also interested in how early educators actually have an impact. And so an aspect of this study that we're offering for participants to be involved in is to actually have the child do some of these tasks with their teacher or with their daycare provider to see how that interaction can impact the child's development. And a third cool aspect of the study is we're not just interested in this observational aspect of emotion regulation, we're also doing brain imaging. So we're using EEG methodology to look at electrical brain waves when we explain to a kid, this is what you should do. You should try to regulate your emotions doing this strategy. And then we see how we can actually see that in their brain activity. So that's another cool aspect of the study. So that's a huge study. It's actually being done in collaboration with Dr. Jessie Lee McIsaac, as well as Dr. Christine Lackner here at the Mount and colleagues also in Ontario. So we're really excited to launch that study soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those explanations of your projects. They're all so wonderful and interesting, and I think a lot of people have interest in them. And I also think it's so cool you do different methods. You're kind of getting multiple different pieces of the big picture, which is really, really interesting. If anyone wants to learn more about your work, how can they do that?
Yeah, so we have different social media kind of presence. So we have an Instagram account, I have a Twitter account, a Facebook account as well. So checking that for updates. Also, our research center website is a great way to stay up to date on sort of what we're doing. So that's dpresearchcenter.com. And if you have direct questions, feel free to email me, or we have a lab email where we can take general questions as well.
I really want to give a huge thank you to you, Dr. Khoury, and the DPRC team for taking time to prepare this whole takeover that we had on our Instagram story and for doing this Q&A with me. I also want to thank those who have taken time to learn with me about this important work. And if anyone has questions, you can send us a message and we'll pass it along to the DPRC. Or you can email them directly. But again, thank you, Dr. Khoury, and also thank you to your team member, Kira, who helped organize a lot of the information for this takeover, and to the rest of your team.
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you so much for putting this together. And I also want to thank Kira, who's my lab manager, who's put a lot of work into preparing the materials for the takeover. So huge thanks to her and to, again, to you and the ECCRC for putting this together. So thanks so much.